That was a really useful session, and I would see it very much as putting together the individual pieces of the jigsaw that collectively be able to articulate the alternative that we know is there. We do have time to open up some short discussions, so if people...
A quick question for Michael Burke. How much of the balances in the corporate sector in Ireland are actually owned by foreign companies?
A comment just to really thank the work that has been done on that audit. It's really extremely useful, and I think it very much meets a need for information at this time. Just on a point of information, the senior bond that is being redeemed on the 2nd of November, which was mentioned yesterday, is about €700 million, just over it actually, and that's just about equal to the difference between a 4.4 billion fiscal adjustment and a fiscal adjustment of 3.6 billion. That's just one bond, senior, non-collateralized and unguaranteed bond. We don't have to pay it actually. And the other, there's a whole list of bond redemptions coming up, including I think another one for 1.25 billion in the beginning of 2012. Put those two together, just those two bonds, and you get 3 billion, which is precisely the value of primary school education budget in the country.
How can we get a more informed debate and maybe a more positive outcome or a different outcome in relation to the issue of planning density and high-rise, if even in limited geographic areas? Because if we want to get 1 year of Class A office space left in the city, what is going to happen when the big investors come looking for space as the economy picks up?
Okay. The question I was specifically asked, that's one of the areas where the authorities treat this sort of information as a state secret. However, so it's not clear what proportion is domestic and what proportion is foreign. However, they do identify domestic profits, which would be the basis for these savings, and they're rising sharply once more. And what they are as a proportion of total value added is the second highest in the European Union as a proportion of total value, the highest being Greece. And that's not accidental. The reason that those economies are, including this one, are so fragile is because far too much of value added is extracted as profit and is therefore ultimately as corporate savings, because it follows if they make lots of profits but they don't invest, then they must be saving it. And that data is in there, is in that pile of information. So the short answer is I don't know precisely about that number, but what we can adduce is that there's a very sizable pool of domestic savings in the corporate sector because there's a very high level of domestic corporate profitability and no corporate investment. The question I was specifically asked, that's one of the areas where the authorities treat this sort of information as a state secret. However, so it's not clear what proportion is domestic and what proportion is foreign. However, they do identify domestic profits, which would be the basis for these savings, and they're rising sharply once more. And what they are as a proportion of total value added is the second highest in the European Union as a proportion of total value, the highest being Greece. And that's not accidental. The reason that those economies are, including this one, are so fragile is because far too much of value added is extracted as profit and is therefore ultimately as corporate savings, because it follows if they make lots of profits but they don't invest, then they must be saving it. And that data is in there, is in that pile of information. So the short answer is I don't know precisely about that number, but what we can adduce is that there's a very sizable pool of domestic savings in the corporate sector because there's a very high level of domestic corporate profitability and no corporate investment.
Okay, thanks, Michael. And I don't
just want to briefly pick up on Tom Ely's point. He was referring to the unsecured, unguaranteed bonds in Anglo-Irish. Is correct, 720 million in November, 1.25 billion in January, promissory note payment of 3.1 billion in March, about 5 billion, over the next few months. I'll just make this point. These are political choices that we make. And work that I did with Tom MacDonald and Michael Burke on the cost of Anglo-Irish on foot of recently released information by the Minister for Finance indicates that over the next 20 years, it will cost directly a charge on the Exchequer of 90 billion euros to wind down Anglo-Irish and Irish nationwide. 90 billion euros. That's a political choice. We can pay that, or we can do something a little bit more productive with it.
Thanks, Michael. And Sheila?
And just briefly on that, I think it highlights an important point when people talk about, burn the bondholders or the national debt. One of the points we try to bring out in the audit is it's not a homogenous mass. There's some debt that's more clearly incurred than other debt, and the unguaranteed bonds and the promissory note to Anglo, they're right at the end of the scale. So I think it's really quite important to focus on the aggregated type of debts.
Thanks. And Kieran, if you could take up Senan's question there.
Yeah. I think that's that's a hugely important question and a hugely important issue to raise, because there are myths going around. You read it a lot in the newspapers that Dublin is coming down in vacant office space and that we've far too much office space. But we don't, as Senan pointed out, we have a limited supply of first-class modern office space that people like Facebook and Google want. And if they can't get it in Dublin, they'll go somewhere else. Again, it's a highly mobile investment. And there's also the critical thing, the long lead-in time that it takes to get a planning permission and to build an office block. But I think it raises a more general point, I think, that there's the planning. I think there's two silos. There's planning, the planning system, which is crucial to the delivery of jobs and is crucial in terms of investment and what benefits we get from investment. And then there's the economic area, like people like you here discussing today, economic issues, and there's very little. These things are intrinsically connected, but the people in the different silos don't talk to one another. And so, for example, economists state very clearly that cities are more productive because they're denser. You get higher productivity, you get greater innovation. But then over on the other side, in terms of planning, there's a thing called plot ratio, which I don't know if you have ever heard of it, but one of the ideas about plot ratio is actually to restrict the density of development in a city. And that is, we have the IGA, we have all our policies of promoting innovation, but then over and somewhere else here, their people, planners, are talking to one another about what plot ratio, what maximum density should be allowed in the city. And it's actually very little. The maximum density in Dublin, say, is about 3.5. A plot ratio of 3.5 is a 3.5-storey building covering an entire site. A plot ratio of 1 is a single-storey building covering an entire site. That's the...
Yeah. No, go on,
yeah. That is the kind of... the restriction that is imposed. And I suppose that's, I think, a useful thing about today is to bring those silos a bit more together.
Thanks, Kieran.
Aaron, look, I share your ambitions for a multicultural city with a high quality of living environment. And maybe your talk today is focused just on Dublin, but surely bad planning has contributed to our problems. I mean, I would like to know how many loans would not have been advanced by the banks, how much debt would not have been created, how much debt would not have had to buy from the banks if, at a very basic level, local councillors had not ignored planning advice.
Thank you.
Imaro Shukru, I'm one of the heroes that you decry. I'm an architect and I'm a valuer and I'm a developer and an environmentalist. And there is a solution. There is a crossover that would deal with this issue of spreading the value added by the investment of the community and the investment of society that creates wealth in cities. And that is site value tax. And I just don't see you supporting it. I don't see the local authorities supporting it. I don't see the city managers supporting it. I see no discussion of it. It's in the programme for government. Site value tax would mean that where a site gets permission for a higher density than before, the windfall value of that does not fall to the landowner, but would fall to the community itself. There are disbenefits from having higher densities for people next door. That has to be recognised. And a site value tax basically takes that created value by the city, by us, by community, by the investment of the state, and it gives it back to us. If we had had site value tax, we wouldn't have had the increase in land values, many land values that created the bubble, that basically gave the basis of the lending, etc., etc. We would not have had the boom, we would not have had the bust. And still yet, I don't see from the left progressives, getting their might behind site value tax so that we don't have a repeat of the current system. We need regulation of the banks, but we also need site value tax or land value tax in order to remove from the equation one of the biggest assets that a boom can be developed around. There are others as well, but land is the biggest one. Thanks.
Thank you, Emer.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to all the speakers, though I must say I am a bit surprised that Dublin City Council are still peddling the same nonsense that has gone on for years and has contributed so dramatically to the problems that we're facing. I mean, Dublin City Council and planning, the phrase is an oxymoron. That if they knew how to plan for 50 years, they've destroyed this city all around, from Tala to Clondalkin to Ballymun to Blanchardstown. The examples are numerous, and they're still pursuing this concept and equating development with building. It's not development that's happening in Dublin and in Ireland. It's building. They just build buildings. And this is partly as a result of a conflict of interest between those who are making the decisions for planning and granting planning permissions and getting paid as a result of the decisions that they've made. And I see there are two TDs here, opposition TDs, and I hope that they take it to the government and pose this question to separate these two responsibilities from the same authority, because they have clearly shown that they are not incapable, and even the development plan, the city development plan that they come up with, they can't stick to. And On Board Pranola has on numerous occasions has chided them for not sticking to their own actual plan even. So thank you very much.
We go off here on with some responses to, I mean, the three are relevant to you.
I think the question about kind of planning in Ireland is a critical one, and I think there's two major mistakes that were made, I think, really. One was the location of development. Locating development in cities is sustainable in a whole series of ways. And building large amounts of housing, whether apartments or whatever, in places where there's no housing demand for that, or there wasn't sufficient housing demand, that was a huge error. And the second one is the quality of development that was allowed is a major issue. And I think that's a matter that all of us have a responsibility for. For example, the quality of apartments that we built in terms of floor area, for example, is just far too small. They're not sustainable in general as places to live. And the City Council radically increased the apartment standards, but irony of ironies, that's almost the time when the boom collapsed. So, but those are, you know, two issues that we could all fess up to in terms of planning: location in the wrong place, and the other one was the quality. And to follow up on Emer's point, I think absolutely the Kenny report is probably one of the great. Well, okay, the fact that we that report was published so long ago and no move was taken on it. But again, I think that it's a very important debate that we should have, the linking again of the economy, of social justice, development and planning.
I think she asked you quite a specific question, though, on site value tax. You know what I mean? Just to be fair, she was quite specific about.
Do I support it? Well, I certainly support some that area, but I think that there certainly is. We have to introduce some form of tax like that.
Site value tax isn't a problem for
Yeah.
Okay. I'm just going to hand over to the progressive left here to get a comment on site value tax specifically.
I'm not an expert on site value tax. I know things like tax increment financing a little bit, which I'm in favour of. Site value tax makes sense to me. I'm as much interested, though, in investment. In fact, I'm more interested in investment than taxation. I just see taxation as a means to an end. So one thing you can do, for example, you can, if you're allowing development, and I mean development, not just a building, is you can stipulate what the developer has to do in addition. We may disagree on that, but I'm very much in favour of that. So, for example, you can make stipulation about the developer creating social affordable housing as well. And so, therefore, you have a tax benefit and you have an investment benefit and the whole community benefits. So I think there's many ways to skin that particular rabbit.
Okay, I can see.
But I think we shouldn't leave it without saying, will the lawyers not tell the government, even if it's in the programme for government, one lawyer will say you need a constitutional amendment to bring aside value tax, and another lawyer will say no, you don't. This has been the long, long argument about the Kenny report. So I think we need some certainty.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to let that continue over coffee break, that particular conversation.